It was December 2020, and my sister, Kelly, and I decided to rent a remote cabin for a quiet Christmas. The idea came to her after a particularly rough year. Both of us had gone through breakups, and with the pandemic keeping everyone on edge, we wanted to get away from the world. Just a week in the woods, surrounded by snow and silence. It sounded perfect. Kelly found the cabin online. It was nestled in the Adirondacks, surrounded by dense pines and miles away from the nearest town. The pictures showed a cozy interior with a stone fireplace, a small kitchen, and a big front porch with rocking chairs. It even came with Christmas decorations, a fully lit tree, and lights strung along the eaves. We booked it immediately. The drive up was uneventful, though the closer we got to the cabin, the more snow began to fall. By the time we turned onto the gravel road leading to the property, the world was white, and the trees were heavy with frost. The cabin appeared through the snow like something out of a postcard, its warm yellow lights glowing against the stormy backdrop. "This is perfect," Kelly said as we stepped out of the car. I nodded, though I couldn't shake a weird feeling, like the forest was watching us. We unpacked quickly, eager to get inside and warm up. The interior was just as charming as the pictures, with a crackling fire in the stone hearth and garlands strung along the walls. It smelled like pine and cinnamon, and for the first time in months, I felt like I could relax. That first night was peaceful. We cooked a simple dinner, drank wine, and watched old Christmas movies by the fire. Outside, the snow continued to fall, blanketing the world in silence. By the time we went to bed, the storm had intensified, the wind howling through the trees. At around 2 a.m. I woke up. At first, I didn't know what had stirred me. The room was dark except for the faint glow of the fire in the living room. Then I heard it, a faint tapping sound, like someone knocking on the window. I froze, listening. The tapping came again, louder this time. It was deliberate, rhythmic, and coming from the window near the kitchen. "Kelly," I whispered, shaking her awake. "What?" she groaned, still half asleep. "Someone's outside." She sat up, her eyes wide. We both stayed silent, listening. The tapping stopped, replaced by the muffled crunch of footsteps in the snow. I grabbed my phone and shone its flashlight toward the window, but I couldn't see anything through the frost-covered glass. "Maybe it's an animal," Kelly said, though her voice didn't sound convinced. We stayed up for another hour, but the sound didn't return. Eventually, we fell back asleep, though neither of us felt entirely at ease. The next morning, the snow had stopped, and sunlight streamed through the windows. Over coffee, we laughed off the events of the night, convincing ourselves it must have been a branch or a curious deer. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling of unease as I stepped outside to check the car. That's when I saw the footprints. They circled the cabin, stopping at each window and the front door. The prints were large and deep, as if whoever had made them had been standing there for a long time. They led back into the woods, disappearing into the trees. "Kelly," I called, my voice shaking. She came outside and froze when she saw the tracks. "Did you hear anything else last night?" she asked. I shook my head, though my memory felt fuzzy. The wine and exhaustion had left me in a haze. We decided to let it go, telling ourselves it was probably a neighbor checking on the property, or a passing hiker. But as the day went on, little things started to feel off. The Christmas lights strung along the porch flickered, though there was no wind. The firewood we'd stacked by the hearth seemed to shift when we weren't looking. And the forest felt different, darker, denser, like it was pressing closer to the cabin. That night, we double-checked all the locks and windows before going to bed. I even wedged a chair under the front door handle, just in case. But deep down, I wasn't sure it would help. At around midnight, the tapping returned. It was louder this time, more insistent. It moved from one window to the next, circling the cabin like before. Kelly and I sat frozen in the living room, clutching our phones and staring at the darkened windows. "Should we call the police?" she whispered. I was about to agree when the tapping stopped. The silence was worse. Then came the footsteps. They were heavy and deliberate, crunching through the snow outside. We held our breath, listening as they moved toward the porch. The door handle rattled, and the chair I'd wedged under it creaked. "Who's there?" I shouted, my voice trembling. There was no response. Just the sound of something scraping against the wood. The footsteps moved again, this time heading toward the back of the cabin. I grabbed a flashlight and crept to the window, peering out into the darkness. For a moment, I saw nothing but snow and shadows. Then I saw it. A figure stood at the edge of the forest, tall and thin, its limbs unnaturally long. Its face was pale and featureless, save for two hollow, glowing eyes. It didn't move, didn't blink, just stared. I stumbled back, my heart hammering. "We need to leave," I whispered. Kelly nodded, already grabbing her coat. We threw our things into bags and bolted for the car, the snow crunching under our boots. As we drove away, I glanced back at the cabin. The figure was standing on the porch now, its glowing eyes following us as we disappeared into the trees. We didn't stop until we reached the nearest town. The locals listened quietly as we told them what had happened, but they didn't seem surprised. "You're lucky," one man said, his voice low. "Most people don't leave that cabin." I didn't ask what he meant. I didn't want to know. It was 2 years ago, right after Christmas, when my boyfriend, Ethan, and I decided to stay at a small rental cabin in Minnesota. We wanted to escape the usual holiday case and spend some time alone, away from the crowded malls and family drama. The cabin was quaint and charming, nestled deep in a wooded valley. It came with all the classic winter touches: a wood-burning stove, a stack of firewood on the porch, and a large front yard perfect for building snowmen. When we arrived, the snow was falling lightly, dusting the trees and giving everything that magical holiday feel. The cabin itself was cozy, with big windows overlooking the forest and a stone fireplace that immediately became our favorite spot. Ethan loved the place so much that he suggested we build a snowman before unpacking, just to mark our territory, as he put it. We worked on the snowman together, rolling up massive snowballs and stacking them in the yard. By the time we finished, the sun was setting, and the temperature was dropping fast. Ethan gave the snowman a crooked grin made of pebbles and a stick nose, and I wrapped one of my old scarves around its neck. It looked almost cheerful, standing there in the fading light. I didn't know it then, but I would come to hate that snowman. That night, the snowstorm rolled in. The wind howled through the trees, and snow piled up against the windows. We stayed inside, drinking hot chocolate and playing board games by the fire. It wasn't until late that I noticed something odd. The snowman had moved. At first, I thought I was imagining it. The wind and the swirling snow made it hard to see, but it looked like the snowman was closer to the cabin than before. I pointed it out to Ethan, but he just laughed. "You're tired," he said. "Maybe the storm shifted the snow around." I nodded, trying to convince myself he was right. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. At around midnight, I woke up to a noise. It was faint at first, like something brushing against the side of the cabin. I sat up, listening, as the sound grew louder. It was a steady, scraping noise moving from one side of the cabin to the other. "Ethan," I whispered, shaking him awake. "What is it?" he mumbled, half asleep. "Listen." We both sat in silence as the scraping sound stopped, replaced by a faint tapping at the window. My heart was pounding as I grabbed my phone and turned on the flashlight, shining it toward the window. The snowman was standing just outside. It was impossible. The snowman we had built was several feet from the cabin, and there was no way it could have moved. But there it was, its pebble grin now crooked and sinister, the scarf hanging limp around its neck. I screamed, and Ethan jumped out of bed. When he saw it, he froze, his face pale. "That's not funny," he said, glaring at me. "Did you move it as a joke? Why would I do that?" I snapped. "I've been in here with you all night." We argued for a moment before deciding to investigate. Ethan grabbed the fire poker, and I followed him to the door, clutching my phone. When we stepped outside, the snowstorm hit us like a wall, the wind whipping snow into our faces. The snowman was gone. We searched the yard, shining the flashlight in every direction, but there were no tracks, no sign of the snowman anywhere. It was like it had vanished into thin air. Ethan tried to laugh it off, saying the wind must have blown it apart, but I could see the unease in his eyes. We went back inside and locked the door, but neither of us slept well that night. The next morning, the snowstorm had passed, leaving the world blanketed in a thick, pristine layer of snow. We decided to leave early, hoping to get back to town before another storm rolled in. As we packed up, I glanced out the window and froze. The snowman was back. It was standing in the same spot where we had built it, as if nothing had happened. But something was different. The pebbles that formed its grin were now jagged, and the scarf was tied tighter, almost like it was choking. "Ethan," I whispered, pointing. He looked out the window and swore under his breath. "We're leaving. Now." We grabbed our bags and bolted to the car, the snow crunching loudly under our boots. I didn't dare look back as we loaded the trunk and climbed in. But as Ethan started the car, he froze. "What?" I asked, panic rising in my chest. "It's blocking the driveway," he said, his voice trembling. I turned and saw it, the snowman, now standing at the edge of the driveway, its jagged grin seeming to widen. The scarf flapped in the wind, and for a moment I thought I saw it move, just a twitch, but enough to make my blood run cold. Ethan floored the gas pedal, and the car lurched forward, plowing through the snow. The snowman shattered as we hit it, the pieces scattering across the yard. But even as we sped down the road, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. When we reached the highway, Ethan finally spoke. "We're never coming back here." I nodded, unable to speak. The cabin was behind us, but the memory of that snowman, its crooked grin and lifeless, staring face, has haunted me ever since. A week later, I saw something that made my stomach drop. Ethan had posted a photo of the snowman on his Instagram, taken right after we built it. But the snowman in the picture wasn't the same. Its grin was already jagged, and its scarf was tied too tightly. We hadn't noticed it then. I deleted the app and haven't been back to the woods since. It was Christmas Eve 2019, and I had just moved into a small rental house in a quiet Vermont town. I didn't have much furniture yet, just a couch, a bed, and a tiny artificial Christmas tree that I'd found on sale at the local thrift store. It wasn't much, but it felt cozy, and I was looking forward to spending my first Christmas alone in peace. The house itself was old but charming, with creaky wood floors, a stone fireplace, and large windows that overlooked a snow-covered backyard. Beyond the yard was a stretch of forest that seemed to go on forever. The realtor had mentioned something about hunters using the woods in the winter, but I hadn't seen anyone since I moved in. That night, the snow started falling heavily, and I curled up on the couch with a blanket, watching the flakes drift down under the glow of the porch light. The house was silent except for the occasional groan of the wind outside. It felt like I was the only person in the world, and I liked it. Until I noticed the footprints. They appeared suddenly, just beyond the light's reach, a trail of them leading from the edge of the forest to the middle of the backyard. At first, I thought they might belong to a deer or some other animal, but they were too large, too distinct, clearly human. I leaned closer to the window, squinting to make sure I wasn't imagining things. The prints were fresh, standing out sharply against the otherwise pristine snow. They didn't make sense. I hadn't seen or heard anyone outside, and the footprints stopped abruptly about 20 feet from the house, as if whoever had made them had simply vanished. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe it was an optical illusion, or maybe the wind had erased the rest of the trail. But even as I tried to rationalize it, I couldn't shake the unease crawling up my spine. I pulled the curtains closed and went to bed, leaving the porch light on just in case. At around 2 a.m., I woke to the sound of knocking. It was faint at first, a soft tapping against the glass. I lay there, heart pounding, straining to hear. Then it came again, louder this time, deliberate and rhythmic. I grabbed my phone and crept to the window, pulling the curtain back just enough to peek outside. The porch was empty, the yard blanketed in snow. But the footprints were back. They were closer now, leading from the middle of the yard to the front porch. My breath fogged the glass as I stared at them, my mind racing. There were no new prints leading away from the porch, no sign of anyone leaving. I backed away from the window, my pulse hammering in my ears. The knocking started again, this time from the back door. It was louder now, more insistent, like whoever, or whatever, was out there wanted to be let in. I didn't go to the door. Instead, I grabbed the fireplace poker and sat on the couch, my eyes darting between the windows. The knocking moved, circling the house, tapping on each window in turn. By dawn, the knocking had stopped, but the footprints remained. They circled the house now, overlapping and crisscrossing in erratic patterns. I called the local police, explaining what had happened, though I felt foolish doing it. What was I supposed to say? That a stranger had left footprints but disappeared into thin air? The officer who arrived was polite but skeptical. He checked the yard, confirming the footprints were real, but he had no explanation for them. "Probably just kids messing around," he said. "Snow makes people weird." I nodded, though I didn't believe him. That night, the snow started again, heavy and relentless. I locked every door and window, even wedging a chair under the front doorknob for extra security. The footprints had been covered by the fresh snow, and for a while, I convinced myself that I'd imagined the whole thing. Then the power went out. The house plunged into darkness, the only light coming from the faint glow of the snow outside. I fumbled for my phone, using its flashlight to navigate. I found some candles in the kitchen and lit them, their flickering light casting long shadows across the walls. That's when I heard it. A whisper. It was faint, almost inaudible over the wind, but it was there. A low, rasping voice coming from somewhere just outside the house. I froze, the candle in my hand trembling as I strained to listen. Then came the knocking. It was louder this time, more forceful. The front door rattled on its hinges, and the chair I'd wedged under the knob shifted slightly. I backed away, clutching the fireplace poker, my heart pounding in my chest. "Who's there?" I shouted, my voice cracking. The only response was the whisper, growing louder, more urgent. I ran to the window and pulled the curtain aside, shining my phone's flashlight into the yard. The beam cut through the swirling snow, illuminating the figure standing in the middle of the yard. It was tall and thin, its body draped in tattered, frost-covered fabric. Its face was pale and elongated, with hollow, glowing eyes that burned like embers in the darkness. It didn't move, didn't blink, just stood there, watching. The whispers stopped. Then it smiled. The grin stretched impossibly wide, revealing jagged, frost-covered teeth. The figure took a step forward, then another, its movements slow and deliberate. I stumbled back, the phone slipping from my hand and clattering to the floor. The knocking returned, louder than ever, now coming from every door and window at once. The house seemed to vibrate with the force of it, the walls groaning under the pressure. I screamed, covering my ears as the whispers rose to a deafening crescendo. When I woke up, it was morning. The power was back on, the house quiet and still. I stumbled outside, blinking in the harsh sunlight. The yard was untouched, the snow pristine. There were no footprints, no sign that anyone, or anything, had been there. But I knew what I'd seen. And every time it snows, I hear the whispers again, faint and distant, like they're calling me back.